Greetings all, this is Mr. Drysdale again, and today I'm going to do a yeast starter using an Erlenmeyer flask and a stir plate. I hope this is helpful. The equipment I'm going to use today is a 250 milliliter Erlenmeyer propagation flask and 2 liters of water. I'm going to use around 6 ounces of dried malt extract. Of course, I'm going to use a stir bar and an airlock with my stir plate. And today we're going to be using California Ale yeast from White Labs. First thing we're going to do is heat up that 2 liters of water till boiling and then add the dried malt extract. I like to add a little bit of hop pellets in there just to help the yeast adjust to the acids in the hops. I try to use the same hops as I would use in the beer that I'm brewing. It's not necessary to use hops in your starter, but I've just done it from habit. This is a pretty standard yeast starter procedure. I got all the notes from Jamil Janishev of MrMalty.com. That's a great website to look at to get the basics of yeast starters and yeast propagation down. While I'm boiling my water, I like to soak the Erlenmeyer flask, the stir bar, a funnel, and the airlock in a bucket of iodophor. Make sure everything's good and sanitized. Now that our water's boiling, it's time to add the dried malt extract. What I've done first is I've turned off the stove. The water is still boiling. I'm going to add my malt extract. It's going to sink to the bottom. As you can see, it's going to boil up pretty well. Turn the stove back up and I've got a whisk. I'm going to make sure the DME doesn't sit on the bottom and scorch on the bottom of the pan. So I'll just stir it for a few minutes and get it back to boiling and boil for about 15 minutes. We got a nice boil going on. Look like we're going to actually boil it over the stove if we're not careful. So what I like to do if when it is going to start to boil back up again is just lift it off the stove for a minute or two. You don't want to make the wife angry by making a big mess on the stove, especially late at night. Now we've got a nice rolling boil going. We're going to let it stop, let it continue for about 15 minutes. We've been boiling for 15 minutes now. That's enough time to get everything good and sanitized and sterilized in our wort. What I want to do is I want to take a small sample of the wort and test the gravity on it. That'll be more than enough. And now what I'm going to do is just put a lid on it. We've turned the stove off. And we're going to let it set. Instead of a hydrometer, I'm going to use a refractometer to test the gravity of this specific wort. We don't want to make a very large gravity wort for our starter. We want to be somewhere between 1030 and 1040. And using 6 ounces of dried malt extract and 2 liters of water should provide that for us. Basically what you do with a refractometer is you put a drop on this device here. It's got a little prism that you can judge the sugars. Comes out to 10 bricks, and which basically is a 1040 gravity. To expedite the cooling of the wort, I've already poured it into the Erlenmeyer flask, and I put some aluminum foil over the opening of it, and I've placed it in the sink with ice around it. Hopefully it'll get down to pitching temperature fairly quickly this way. I've got the starter cooled down. I've got it all in the Erlenmeyer flask. I've got the airlock on it. I've got the stir bar inside of the flask, and I've also got it sitting on the stir plate, and I'm ready to pitch the yeast. What I'm going to do now is get ready to pitch the yeast in the Erlenmeyer flask. What I'd like to do is take an alcohol swab and kind of clean up the cap of the yeast. This may be overkill, but I just like to make sure it's good and clean. I've cracked it open, I've released the pressure, and I also want to shake it up and make sure I get all the yeast cells out of the bottom of it. My Erlenmeyer flask is ready to go. I've got the stir bar inside, and I'm pitching the yeast. The yeast is right at room temperature now. I'm going to put the airlock back on there, shake it around a little bit, set it back on the stir plate, and I'm ready to start it up. Now that I've pitched the yeast, I'm ready to turn on the stir plate. I don't know if you can see it or not, but it is rotating at the bottom. There is a nice flow of the liquid from the bottom of the stir plate to the top. We've got a nice foam on top that shows that we've got oxygen inside of the Erlenmeyer flask. The stir bar is working, and you can see a little bit of motion right there at the center of the vortex. And we're going to let it set overnight and see how it looks in the morning. It's been about 30 hours now, and you can see we've got a nice starter going, lots of fermentation. And I'm getting ready to start my beer for the morning. And we will pitch later on this afternoon. And it looks like we've got a good yeast starter going here. What I've done is put the Erlenmeyer flask inside my fermentation deep freezer, and I've let it sit in here for the last hour or so with the beer that I made this afternoon. It's in my 10-gallon Corny fermenter, and I'm ready to oxygenate the wort and then pitch the yeast. I've got my oxygen bottle hooked up to a wand with a stone on the end of it, and I placed it inside my fermenter, and I'm oxygenating the wort before I pitch the yeast. What I like to do is make sure the neck of the Erlenmeyer flask is good and clean, so I'm going to douse it with a little water and Everclear just to make sure everything's good and sanitized on the opening there. That was poor camera work there. Sorry about that. Now I'm ready to pitch the yeast. Got to be real careful since I've got my stir bar inside of it. Okay, we've got everything oxygenated. We've got the yeast pitched inside. We're ready to seal it up. I've got my blow-off valve set up into a jug of iodophor, and we'll see if we have fermentation tomorrow.